The silence in the parking lot seemed suffocating, as if the world had stopped in that moment when I saw them walk through the hotel doors together. She wore that red dress. The same dress I bought for our last anniversary. The same dress that, the night I gave it to her, she cried, saying she never imagined anyone could love her so much. Now he held her around the waist with a confidence that made me feel nauseous. His hands were, until yesterday, only I should touch. They didn't see me right away. They were laughing. An intimate, light laugh, as if that moment belonged only to them. But then, she looked up and saw me. His eyes froze. The blood disappeared from the face. She stopped. He stopped. And I stood still too, but only on the outside, because inside, something had already begun to break into irreparable pieces. She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. I didn't want to hear anything. Not there. Not now. Because at that moment, I already had everything I needed to know. The strange messages on the cell phone. The disjointed excuses. The meetings that never ended on time. I should have seen it before. Should have connected the dots. But love, or perhaps its blindness, had kept me still as she walked away, step by step, until she was no longer the same woman who promised to love me. And now I was there, laughing, smiling, living a life I didn't even know existed. With another man. In the hotel where, years ago, we spent our honeymoon. The same hotel. The same damn hotel. I didn't leave. I didn't turn my back. Because, at that moment, I knew. I knew I wouldn't let that go without consequences. I knew that every detail of that plan that had been forming in my mind over the last few weeks, every calculated step, every silent movement, would now be put into practice. She didn't know it, but the divorce was already on the way. The papers were ready. But that? That was just the beginning. Because betrayals like this don't die in silence. They demand justice. And I was prepared to give her exactly what she deserved. I passed them. I looked into her eyes. I didn't look away. And it was at that moment that I saw fear. Fear not for what she had done, but for what I could do. Fear because, perhaps for the first time, she knew I was capable of something she never imagined. The lover. He tried to say something, but the silence between us was stronger. I smiled. A smile that he clearly didn't understand, but that made him squeeze her arm, as if trying to protect her. As if she could still be protected. I got into the car. I started the engine, but didn't drive away immediately. I waited. I waited to see what they would do. And, as expected, they left in a hurry. She looked back repeatedly. He held her arm, trying to hurry her along. They disappeared down the corridor. And I continued there. Observing. Because, while they were trying to cover their tracks, I had already left their path marked. Because what started as a common betrayal was about to become something much bigger. Something no one could have predicted. Not even me. In the following days, I remained calm. I continued smiling. I remained the man she thought she knew. Because the plan needed time. And I was willing to wait. As she apologized for being late. While she invented meetings. As she smiled, as if nothing had happened. She didn't know I had photos. Videos. She didn't know I knew his name. His address. I didn't know that I had already scheduled the first meeting with my lawyer. But most of all, she didn't know the worst was yet to come. When the moment arrived, I made sure everything would be perfect. It was easy to attract her friends. I invited everyone to a celebration. A special dinner. To renew vows, I said. She smiled. He said it was a wonderful idea. He said he loved me. And it was at that moment that I realized how empty words could be. How love could turn into poison. And then came the final blow. In the middle of dinner, I got up. I made a toast. I talked about love. About trust. And, when everyone expected me to end with a declaration of love, I projected the images onto the screen. She with him. At the hotel. In the parking lot. The laughs. The kisses. The silence in the room was absolute. I heard the glass fall from her hand. I heard the sighs. And I saw her lover, pale, trying to hide his face. But it was already too late. Because, at that moment, everyone saw what I saw. Everyone felt what I felt. And nothing could erase that. Nothing. When the trouble started, I left. I didn't stay to see the tears. I didn't stay to hear the excuses. Because I already knew what would come next. I knew this was just the beginning. Because even after the public humiliation passed, even after the marriage ended, the consequences would continue. And in the end, I knew there was something more. Something I hadn't told you yet. Something that would change everything again. Something that would make her wish she had never cheated on me. Something no one saw coming. Not even me. Welcome to the channel, where we explore the intense dramas and devastating consequences of betrayal. Make it clear right now, this channel does not support or romanticize infidelity. The stories told here are fictional, but they carry deep truths about how betrayal can destroy relationships, families, and entire lives. These are stories that reveal the dangers of lies, the pain of deceit, and the scars left by those who choose to betray. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is shocking, emotional, and unforgettable. A story that will stir your feelings and maybe even make you question your own choices. Now, settle in. The story is about to begin. Golden late afternoon light streamed through the living room's wide windows, dancing across the cream leather sofa and casting soft shadows across the walls. Ethan was sitting in the armchair he used to call his throne, with a glass of whiskey in his hand and staring at his cell phone screen. His furrowed eyebrows revealed that something was going on in his thoughts, but he hid it well. He always knew how to hide feelings, even from himself. However, that afternoon, it felt different. He looked at his cell phone as if waiting for an answer that never came. A recent habit that he himself still couldn't explain. A few steps away, Claire was setting the table for dinner. The sound of the cymbals meeting the glass sounded almost rehearsed. She was methodical, organized, the perfect wife, at least that's how everyone saw her. His movements were smooth, but his gaze betrayed restlessness. From time to time, he cast quick glances at Ethan, as if trying to read him, as if seeking some invisible confirmation that everything was okay. She hated feeling that weight on her chest, but lately it was always there, firm and suffocating. It was 10 years together. 10 years of promises and plans, of romantic dinners and discussions about bills, of memorable trips and silent nights sharing the same roof. The kind of marriage that stood the test of time, or at least it seemed that way to others. When they met, it was as if the world had stopped. Claire was vibrant, passionate, and Ethan, with his discreet charm and penetrating gaze, seemed capable of breaking down all her barriers. And he succeeded. The marriage was quick, perhaps even impulsive, but no one doubted the love that existed between them. In the early years, friends commented on how they seemed made for each other. Claire smiled and said she knew that from their first meeting. Ethan just nodded, preferring to show his feelings in actions rather than words. He was always like that, practical, direct, but full of unexpected gestures that made Claire fall in love with him again and again. Like the time she filled her apartment with candles and rose petals on her 5th wedding anniversary. Or when he showed up at her work just to leave flowers without a card, like a secret admirer. These were the memories Claire held dear, the memories she used to hold on to whenever something inside her questioned whether they were still the same. But time changes people. And lately, Claire felt like she was living with a stranger. Ethan was still physically present, but emotionally he seemed somewhere else. He would arrive late from work, have a quick dinner and spend the rest of the night on his cell phone or in meetings in the makeshift office upstairs. Claire tried hard not to create paranoia, not to harbor suspicions that could just be the result of her exhausting routine. She knew that marriages had phases. And this could be just one more. Ethan, on the other hand, was fighting his own ghosts. Work had become a convenient escape, a refuge where he could pretend everything was under control. But when he closed his eyes at night, his mind went back to the moments when Claire seemed far away, too distracted. He wanted to believe that everything was fine, that the silences were just the result of tiredness. But deep down, I felt something was wrong. Maybe it was just him. Maybe he was being paranoid. Dinner that night was like so many others. Short conversations, forced smiles, silences longer than they should be. Claire asked about the job, and Ethan responded in generalities. Ethan asked about her day, and Claire did the same. And in the end, they both went to sleep with the same silent thoughts, each trapped in their own world. In the following days, the routine continued. Claire was trying to fill the void with household chores and meeting friends. Ethan buried himself even more in work. However, small cracks began to appear. A message that Claire quickly read and deleted. A connection that Ethan answered in the hallway, lowering his voice more than usual. Small details that could easily be forgotten, but that, together, began to form an uncomfortable pattern. The weekend brought an opportunity to reconnect. Claire insisted that they go out to dinner, and Ethan agreed, although reluctantly. The restaurant chosen had been the same as their first date, a desperate attempt to rekindle something that seemed to be fading away. Claire looked beautiful that night, wearing a blue dress that Ethan always praised. He also made an effort, putting on the shirt he knew she liked. They tried to talk, laugh, remember old times. For a moment, it seemed to work. But all it took was a message on Ethan's cell phone to break the spell. He tried to hide his discomfort, but Claire noticed. I always understood. When they returned home, Claire felt the need to confront him, but no words came out. Instead, she just watched him as he walked up the stairs and disappeared into the office. She stood there, alone in the room, looking at the dancing shadows on the walls, wondering if they would ever be who they were again. Meanwhile, Ethan was in the office, staring at his cell phone. I felt the weight of guilt, even without knowing exactly where it came from. He wanted to believe that Claire hadn't noticed anything, that she still trusted him as before. But he knew he was fooling himself. And I also knew that I was about to cross a limit that would never come back. The tension between the two continued to grow in the following days. The smiles became rarer. The shortest conversations. And through it all, Claire began to notice subtle changes. A shirt with a strange scent. A receipt lost in a pants pocket. Details that, alone, meant nothing, but together they began to tell a story. A story that Claire still didn't want to believe, but that she was already beginning to fear. And then came the fateful night. Claire said she had to work late and Ethan, feigning understanding, said he would be home. But something inside him led him to leave. He drove aimlessly for a while, trying to organize his thoughts, until he saw what he didn't want to see. He stopped the car and watched. And it was there, in that parking lot, that everything changed. From that moment on, what had been a life built on trust began to crumble. And as Claire set the breakfast table the next day, with shaking hands and a forced smile, Ethan had already decided. He knew exactly what he needed to do. I knew this was far from over. And I knew, above all, that no one would come out of that story unscathed. The clock was almost midnight and Ethan parked the car at the end of the narrow street. The engine still purred softly as he kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, breathing slowly to try to control the whirlwind of thoughts. The hotel's lights stood out against the dark sky, casting reflections in the puddles of water spread across the asphalt. He shouldn't be there. I knew that. But something compelled him to continue, an invisible and corrosive force that wouldn't let him look away from the illuminated entrance. He watched every move. The receptionist checked documents, the doorman helped a woman get out of a taxi, and everything seemed too normal for the tension that burned in his chest. The last few weeks had been a silent drag, a minefield in which any misplaced word could explode what little was left of the marriage. Claire continued to smile, carrying out her daily rituals with surgical precision, but Ethan noticed the distant looks and the increasingly longer silences. He was trying to believe it was just a phase, one of those low tides that would come and go, but intuition was screaming otherwise. And it was that same intuition that brought him there, driven by the growing emptiness between them and the accumulated excuses that no longer seemed so innocent. The automatic door opened, and Ethan saw her silhouette entering. For a moment, he doubted what his eyes were capturing. It was Claire. Her hair tied into an impeccable bun, the black dress clinging to her body and the heels she rarely wore to work. She walked with hurried steps, looking around as if trying to hide something. He waited. Maybe it was just an event. Maybe she forgot to mention it. But when another man appeared a few seconds later, Ethan's body stiffened. The stranger placed his hand on Claire's waist with a naturalness that made his blood boil. They exchanged smiles, accomplices, and entered together, disappearing down the marble hallway. Ethan let go of the steering wheel and threw himself against the back of the seat, his muscles tense. His mouth went dry, and a bitter taste settled in his throat. He wanted to go in after them, confront them, scream, but he stayed still. I needed more. I needed something that would eliminate any possibility of doubt before I acted. Then he waited. He waited for long minutes that felt like hours. When he finally got out of the car, he took a deep breath and entered the hotel. The receptionist smiled, but he barely noticed. He climbed the stairs, guided by an almost cruel instinct. As he approached the second-floor hallway, he saw the door to one of the bedrooms ajar. Her muffled laughter escaped like a knife piercing his mind. He approached slowly, his heart pounding so loudly that it seemed to echo through the empty hallway. When he pushed the door open, the scene revealed itself like a blow to the gut. Claire was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands on her knees, as the man leaned in to kiss her. She turned her face away at the last second, but it was too late. Ethan had seen enough. Her eyes met his, and panic took over her pale face. The man stood up quickly, adjusting his shirt, but Ethan was already fixated on Claire. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but no words seemed enough to break the heavy silence that had formed. He felt his chest tighten, as if the air had disappeared, but he maintained his composure. Ethan walked away without saying anything, leaving them there, frozen. He walked down the stairs feeling his legs were shaky, but his mind was as clear as ever. There was no room for doubt. Claire had betrayed him. This wasn't just a slip or a misinterpretation. It was real. Cruel. Definitive. Inside the car, he closed his eyes and rested his forehead on the steering wheel, trying to organize his thoughts. The pain came in waves, increasingly intense, but there was something more there, something growing in the back of his mind and beginning to take shape. He wouldn't let that go. I couldn't leave it. In the following days, Claire tried to continue her life as if nothing had happened. She knew Ethan had seen her, but he didn't say anything. He didn't confront, he didn't demand explanations. And that made her even more restless. He tried to act normally, but his hands were shaking as he prepared the coffee. His gaze seemed longer, more penetrating, as if he were waiting for the right moment to attack her. Ethan watched her every move, recorded every detail. He wanted Claire to feel the weight of guilt, to slowly drown in the uncertainty of what would come next. I kept the routine, but inside I planned each step. I knew it needed to be calculated. Dinner the following Saturday was his chance. He suggested they go out on a date, trying to recreate the old times. Claire hesitated, but eventually agreed. He dressed carefully, trying to hide the tension, but Ethan noticed. During dinner, he was charming, attentive, making you relax. Claire actually laughed a few times, but deep down she felt something was wrong. And she was right. When they returned home, Ethan asked her to sit in the living room while he prepared a surprise. Claire was anxious, but obeyed. Then the lights dimmed, and he turned on the TV. The screen lit up, and the images began to play. First, photos of them together on old trips, happy moments. Then, more recent photos, of the hotel, of the door ajar, of her sitting on the bed with another man. Claire froze, her face losing all color. Ethan remained standing, watching her, waiting for any reaction. She tried to get up, but her legs gave out. The tears started to fall, but he didn't move. He grabbed his car keys and left, leaving Claire alone, crumbling in the face of irrefutable evidence. The path to the lawyer's office was already marked. But his plan wasn't over yet. There was something more. Something Claire didn't yet know. Something that would change everything again. Claire was sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the photos spread out on the coffee table. His shaking hands tried to rearrange the papers, as if he could erase what he saw there. Her tears stained the corners of the images, but nothing seemed capable of undoing that reality. Ethan was standing on the other side of the room, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. The silence between them felt heavier than any words they could exchange. She finally looked up, but his expression remained cold, unwavering. He tried to get up, but his legs gave way. He didn't move. He just watched her, like a judge waiting for the defendant to confess. Claire tried to speak, but her voice broke. He took a deep breath and forced the words out. He apologized, said that it meant nothing, that it had been a mistake. Ethan laughed, a bitter sound that cut the air like a blade. He asked if she really expected him to believe it. I wanted to know since when this was happening. Claire tried to deny it, but he already knew the answer. He said he had seen everything. The hotel. The smiles. The touches. He said he had heard his name in hidden messages and that every piece of that puzzle fit together perfectly. She begged him to believe it was over, but Ethan shook his head, slowly, as if he had heard enough. He crossed the room, picked up the last image and placed it in front of her. Claire looked away, but Ethan demanded she look. He asked how she had the courage. He asked what was missing. She cried, said she didn't know, that she felt alone, invisible. She said she needed to feel desired again. But Ethan interrupted, saying it wasn't about love or desire, it was about selfishness. He pointed to the photos and asked if she could see anything other than betrayal and lies. Claire tried to get closer, but Ethan took a step back, as if her touch burned him. She said she would do anything to make it right, but he laughed again and said it was too late. It was then that Claire realized. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It wasn't just about the photos or the hotel. There was something more. He asked what he had done. Ethan looked at her and, for the first time that night, smiled. But it wasn't a smile of anger or sarcasm. It was an empty, dangerous smile. He told her she should sit down, because this was just beginning. Claire hesitated, but the intensity in his gaze made her obey. Ethan took an envelope from his pocket and threw it on the table. She opened it with trembling fingers and saw the documents. They were divorce papers, but there was something more. Financial documents. Transfers. Sales. She paged through it quickly, trying to understand. It was then that Ethan spoke. He said that, in recent weeks, he had transferred all of the couple's assets into his name. The house, the bank accounts, the investments. He said he had consulted lawyers and made sure Claire was not entitled to anything. She started babbling, saying that he couldn't do that, that was unfair. But Ethan continued. He said that he had tracked her expenses, that he knew about the reservations she had made with her lover. I knew about the hidden money, the planned trips. He said he had gotten ahead of himself and emptied everything. Claire tried to argue, but Ethan interrupted her. He said that she had destroyed everything they had built and that now she would pay for it. She stood up, shouting that this couldn't be happening, that he wasn't that kind of man. But Ethan came over and said it wasn't him who had changed. He said she had forced that transformation. Claire tried to run upstairs, but Ethan grabbed her arm. He asked her if she thought he didn't know everything. He asked her if she really believed he would stand by while she destroyed their lives. Claire broke free and ran into the bedroom, locking the door. Ethan stood outside, knocking hard. She looked for the phone, but he had already removed the line. He picked up his cell phone, but the screen showed no signal. Ethan told her to open the door, that they needed to finish this. Claire refused, shouting that she would call the police. But he laughed. He said she could try, but that no one would believe her after everything he had gathered. He said he had recorded conversations, messages, even videos. She said everything was ready to be used against her if she tried anything. Claire started crying, saying he couldn't do this, but Ethan just continued, cold, determined. After minutes of silence, Ethan went into the living room. Claire unlocked the door and went downstairs slowly, holding back her tears. He was sitting on the couch, looking at the photos once again. She asked what he wanted. Ethan looked at her and said he wanted justice. He said he wanted her to feel everything he felt. Claire fell to the ground, begging for forgiveness, but Ethan remained impassive. Then he told the last detail. He said that he had organized a meeting with friends and family for that night, which everyone already knew about. He said there were no more secrets. Claire went pale, trying to process. Ethan stood up and said he had already made his decision. He grabbed his coat, opened the door and left, leaving Claire alone, devastated, staring at the papers and photos scattered around like fragments of what had once been their lives. But deep down, she knew there was more to come. Something Ethan hadn't said. Something that could destroy what little was left. Claire sat on the floor, hands clutching her face as sobs echoed through the empty room. The silence around seemed to scream louder than any words spoken that night. She tried to organize her thoughts, but everything was in pieces. The photos, the divorce papers, Ethan's words still echoed in her mind like sharp blades. She looked at the door he had left through, hoping he would return, hoping this was just a nightmare. But he knew it wasn't. Ethan was gone, and with him, he took everything she knew. He forced himself to get up and went to the kitchen, trying to control the tremor in his hands. He turned on the tap, splashed water on his face and took a deep breath. I needed to think, act, but each step seemed more difficult than the last. He opened drawers, looked for his cell phone again, but nothing worked. Ethan had planned everything. He had anticipated it, blocked every exit. She felt her stomach turn when she realized the precision with which he had disarmed her. He looked around, as if he could find an answer hidden in some corner of the house. But everything seemed empty, as if it no longer belonged there. The sound of the doorbell made his entire body shudder. He walked slowly to the door, his heart hammering in his chest. When he opened it, he saw his younger sister, Rachel, standing there, her eyes wide. Claire tried to speak, but Rachel entered without waiting for an invitation, closing the door behind her. Rachel dropped her bag on the couch and crossed her arms. He asked if it was true, if everything Ethan had said and shown was real. Claire tried to explain herself, but Rachel interrupted her. He said he couldn't believe it. He said he had defended Claire all night, trying to justify the images, the evidence, but now, seeing her condition, he knew it was all true. Claire started crying again, begging Rachel to understand, but she didn't seem willing to listen. Rachel asked how Claire had the courage, how she could betray someone like Ethan after everything he did for her. He asked if she even thought about the consequences. Claire screamed, saying that it wasn't that simple, that there were feelings, needs, emptiness that Ethan never noticed. Rachel laughed bitterly and said that nothing justified what she had done. He said the worst thing about it was that now everyone knew. parents, friends, co-workers. He said Claire had destroyed not only the marriage but her own reputation. Claire begged Rachel to stay by her side, but her sister shook her head and took the bag. He said he was just there to pick up some clothes and documents that Ethan asked to be given to the lawyer. Claire was shocked, but Rachel continued, saying he was already taking care of everything. Claire tried to stop her, holding her sister's arm, but Rachel let go, saying there was nothing left to do. Before leaving, he looked at Claire with a mixture of pity and anger and said that he hoped she would understand, one day, the extent of the damage she had caused. As soon as the door closed, Claire fell onto the sofa. She felt destroyed. There was no one else beside her. Ethan had taken everything. Your safety, your reputation, even your family. But deep down, I knew I couldn't give up. He needed to fight, if only to regain some of his lost dignity. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of knocking on the door. He opened it slowly and found Ethan. He was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made her shudder. He entered without asking permission, closed the door and stood there, staring at her. Claire tried to speak, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. He said he was just there to make it clear how things would be from now on. He explained that he had already removed all of his clothes and personal belongings. He said the house would be put up for sale in the next few days and that Claire would need to move out soon. He handed over an envelope with details about the division of assets and demanded that she sign it as soon as possible. Claire tried to argue, but Ethan cut her off, saying he had already acted with more patience than she deserved. She approached, desperate, asking him to reconsider. He said he would do anything to make right what he had done. She said she still loved him, that they could still try. Ethan stared at her for long seconds, as if analyzing every word. Then, finally, he spoke. He said there was something she needed to know. Something that would change everything. Ethan said he had known about the betrayal for weeks. He said that at first he thought about confronting her, but then decided to wait. He decided to take calculated revenge. And that's when he found something that Claire would never have imagined. He revealed that the man she cheated on him with was not just any stranger. It was his old best friend. A man Ethan had helped in the worst time of his life, when he was unemployed and without hope. Ethan had taken him in, helped him start over, and that's how he met Claire. The revelation fell like a punch in the stomach. Claire tried to deny it, but Ethan continued. She said she had discovered old messages, conversations that showed that the affair had started much earlier than she had admitted. He said that her lover had used everything he knew about Ethan to manipulate her, to turn Claire against him. Claire started to cry, but Ethan didn't stop. He said he had already exposed everything to his lover's wife, who was also getting a divorce and had vowed to destroy his reputation. He said that, soon, his lover would lose his job, his friends and everything he had. Claire begged him not to do it, but Ethan said it was too late. She said that this was just the beginning and that, when it was all over, no one would look at her or him the same way again. Ethan picked up the papers again and placed them in front of her. He said she had two choices, sign and accept his conditions or risk fighting in court, where he was sure he would emerge victorious. Claire looked at the documents, but she couldn't see anything but blurs. She felt herself sinking, being crushed by the weight of the consequences of her choices. Ethan got up and said he would come back the next day to get the signed papers. He looked at Claire one last time before leaving and, for the first time, she saw tears in his eyes. But it was quick. Ethan blinked, turned his back and walked away, leaving Claire alone in what was left of a life that would never be the same. Claire sat there, staring at the papers spread out on the table. His eyes burned, his tears had dried, but the pain in his chest persisted as if every word Ethan said still echoed in his mind. She ran her trembling fingers over the printed lines, trying to absorb what was before her. The divorce contract, the conditions imposed, the silent promise that nothing they once shared would ever be hers again. She felt the weight of humiliation, the weight of seeing her life being dismantled piece by piece and, worse than that, she knew she had dug that grave alone. He tried to convince himself that Ethan was being cruel, that his reaction was disproportionate, but at the same time, he knew he had no right to expect anything else. He had trusted her. And she had destroyed it. The room seemed to tighten around her, suffocating. He needed air, space, but even his own body felt like a burden too heavy to carry. He stood up, tripping over one of the papers that fell to the floor, but didn't bother to pick it up. He walked to the window and faced the dark street. The emptiness outside reflected the emptiness inside her. He thought about calling Rachel, but the memory of her sister's disappointed look made him give up. She thought about looking for her lover, but the idea of seeing him brought a lump to her throat. He was the reason for all of this and he suddenly seemed so insignificant. She felt stupid, used, thrown aside by someone who never had anything to lose. The minutes dragged by until the sound of footsteps outside made Claire flinch. For a moment, she thought Ethan had returned, perhaps for one last conversation, but when the door opened, it was Rachel again. She walked in unceremoniously, her face filled with the same hard expression as before, but there was something different in her eyes. Claire waited for another lecture, but Rachel dropped her bag on the chair and crossed her arms, saying she had just finished talking to Ethan. He had left determined to move on, but Rachel thought there was something in him that still resisted, something that made him hesitate. Claire wanted to believe that, wanted to hold on to the possibility that there was still something between them that could be saved. Rachel asked if Claire really believed she could fix this. Claire hesitated. I wanted to say yes, I would do anything, but deep down I knew I had already crossed all limits. She said she loved Ethan, that she never wanted to hurt him, but that she lost herself. Rachel sighed tiredly and said that maybe it was too late for love. Maybe what he needed now was justice, and Claire needed to accept that. The words echoed in her mind after Rachel left. She was alone again, wandering around the house that no longer felt like hers. He climbed the stairs slowly, past the room they once shared and stopped in front of the empty closet. His clothes were no longer there. His scent was no longer there. She felt her heart sink as she realized how his absence had filled everything. He sat on the floor, hugging his knees, and tried to imagine what it would be like to move forward. In the following days, Claire avoided leaving the house. The phone rang, but she didn't answer. I knew people were talking, I knew that Ethan's friends had already spread the story and that there was no way to escape. He felt invisible. She walked around the house like a ghost, surrounded by memories that seemed to mock her. He began to question whether he really deserved to stay there, in that house, in that life. She thought about leaving before Ethan could even get her out, but she had nowhere to go. There was no one else. When she finally found the courage to call Ethan, he answered with a coldness that made her shudder. He said he only had one reason to see her, he wanted to know if the papers were signed. Claire tried to prolong the conversation, tried to ask how he was doing, but Ethan was direct. He said she no longer had the right to ask anything about him. He said the only thing that mattered now was ending it. Claire begged him to come back, so they could talk one more time, but he refused. The following days were even heavier. Claire tried to distract herself, tried to focus on reading or cleaning the house, but nothing seemed enough to fill the void. When he finally picked up the papers and started to sign, his hands were shaking so much that he had to stop several times. Each signature felt like a final sentence, a permanent goodbye. The morning Ethan returned to get the documents, Claire felt butterflies in her stomach. He walked in with the same firm stance, but there was something in his eyes that made her believe that maybe there was still a chance. He took the papers without saying anything, flipped through each page to confirm, and then put everything back in his folder. Claire tried to get closer, but Ethan moved away. He said it didn't change anything. But before leaving, Ethan stopped at the door and looked at her. He said he had tried to understand, that he had spent sleepless nights trying to find a reason to forgive her, but that he couldn't forget. He said that maybe one day he would be able to look at her without feeling angry, but he didn't know when that would happen. Claire tried to respond, but he had already turned his back and left. In the days that followed, Claire struggled to find some kind of balance. He started looking for apartments, started packing his things. But with each closed box, she felt like she was burying another piece of herself. She thought about looking for Ethan again, but she knew he was too far gone to come back. Meanwhile, Ethan was also struggling with his own feelings. He felt vindicated, but empty. Every step taken against Claire seemed to ease the pain, but only for an instant. Then, the emptiness, the regret, the memory of what they had once been returned. He tried to move on, but anger and love still mixed within him, creating a conflict that seemed impossible to resolve. Time passed slowly for both of them, but each knew the end was approaching. The dilemma now was whether that end would bring peace or just more destruction. Both were trapped in a maze of their own choices, struggling to find a way out before everything fell apart once and for all. Ethan stopped in front of the house for the last time. The facade that once symbolized the beginning of a happy life now seemed just a distant memory of everything that had been destroyed. The for sale sign was swaying slightly in the wind, and the window in the room they once shared was dark. He held the keys in his hand, but he knew there was nothing left to look for there. He had already collected his things, erased his footprints and left Claire behind. However, the weight of that decision still accompanied him. He felt free, but at the same time empty. The anger had lost its strength and left only an echo of disappointment and regret. Even after everything he did to get revenge, the pain persisted, as if nothing was capable of erasing the betrayal. On the other side, Claire watched from afar, hidden behind the curtain of the rented apartment where she had been living since leaving the house. The place was small, stuffy, and the white walls seemed to scream loneliness. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by boxes that she still didn't have the courage to open. Old photos were in one of them, covered by clothes she no longer wore. She had tried to move on, but every corner of that space reminded her of what she had lost. I thought about the moments I could have done differently, about all the opportunities one missed. The deleted messages, the empty apologies, the averted looks. She knew she had destroyed the man she loved most, but she also knew she had destroyed herself in the process. She felt trapped, as if she were paying for every lie told, for every night spent next to another man. Ethan got back in the car and stood there for a few minutes before starting the engine. She thought about Claire, about the years they spent together, about the plans they made and everything that was left behind. He wanted to feel hatred, he wanted to justify his actions with the pain she had caused, but he could no longer feed that feeling. There was nothing to be said or done that would change what had already happened. She betrayed him, and he destroyed her in response. But now, the void between them was all that was left. He started the car and drove without looking back, determined not to let that story continue to haunt him. Claire spent the next few days in silence, without speaking to anyone. Rachel had stopped calling, her friends had disappeared, and even her lover had moved on without looking back. She felt alone in a way she never imagined possible. She tried to find meaning in continuing, but every thought led back to the same point: she had lost everything. He tried to look for work, but gossip had spread, making each interview uncomfortable. The world seemed too small to escape the shadow of what he had done. She thought about calling Ethan several times, but she knew he wouldn't answer. I knew that, for him, that story was already buried. However, for Ethan, the past still haunted him. Even though he tried to convince himself that he had moved on, his dreams betrayed him. I saw Claire in happy moments, in stolen kisses, in smiles during travel. But he also saw the images in the hotel, another man's hands where only his should be. He tried to delete it, but nothing worked. He began to wonder if destroying Claire had been enough for him to feel at peace. Her face crying on the living room floor was still etched in his mind. He was wondering if it would have been different if he had tried to save the marriage instead of destroying it. But it was too late for regrets. Life went on for both of them in different ways. Ethan moved to another city, starting over as if he wanted to erase every memory of the past. He met new people but remained distant, unable to trust again. The fear of being betrayed still accompanied him, like an invisible shadow. No matter how much he tried to make room for a new love, something always made him retreat. He felt scarred, as if Claire's betrayal had left scars too deep to heal. Claire, on the other hand, sank even further. She tried to seek comfort from her lover, but he avoided her, afraid of the consequences he still faced at work and in his family. She felt used, discarded, like a mistake everyone wanted to forget. He started drinking to try to forget, but this only made his situation worse. He ended up losing the few opportunities he still had and, over time, he became a shadow of what he once was. She tried to convince herself that she deserved it, that she was paying for her mistakes, but deep down she knew that part of her still wanted to be forgiven. In the end, Ethan and Claire went their separate ways, but they carried the scars of that story forever. He learned to live with the pain, but he was never able to completely erase the past. She lost herself among her own regrets, unable to find a way back. And so, the betrayal that began as a moment of weakness ended up destroying not just a marriage, but also 2 lives. Each person paid the price for the choices they made, proving that, in stories like this, there are rarely winners. If you've made it this far, leave in the comments what you thought of this story and share your opinion on the character's outcome. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Always remember that this channel does not support any type of betrayal, but explores the real and devastating consequences that it can bring to people's lives. Until the next story.